attention to this footage. What you're seeing was captured on a mobile phone by a passing fisherman in rural Tanzania. Two figures in protective suits crouched beside what appears to be a large animal lying motionless on sandy ground near a marshy area. Look closely at the person in black. Watch their hands. They're not trying to help this creature. They're documenting it, recording measurements, taking samples. And if you look at the animal's mouth, you'll notice something that shouldn't be there. Something metallic, something deliberately placed. This footage would become the key piece of evidence in one of the most disturbing cases of scientific obsession ever documented in East Africa. What started as a concerned citizen's recording of what looked like a rescue operation would expose a serial pattern of torture that had been going on for years, hidden in plain sight. You know that feeling when you see something that just doesn't sit right with you? When every instinct in your body is screaming that something's wrong, even if you can't quite put your finger on it? That's exactly what Moses Kimathi felt on the morning of June 14, 2019, when he was walking along the Rufiji River Delta in southeastern Tanzania, checking his fishing nets like he'd done 1,000 times before. Moses was a simple man, 53 years old, father of 4, grandfather of 2. He'd been fishing these waters since he was a boy, knew every bend in the river, every spot where the catfish liked to hide. But on this particular morning, something caught his eye that he'd never seen before. Two people in white and black protective suits crouched over what looked like a massive animal near the water's edge. Now, Moses had seen plenty of wildlife in his lifetime. The Rufiji Delta was home to all sorts of creatures. But this was different. The animal was huge, easily the size of a small car, lying motionless on the sandy bank. And these two people weren't acting like wildlife rangers responding to an emergency. They were too calm, too methodical. One of them was taking photographs while the other seemed to be examining the creature's mouth with some kind of tool. Moses pulled out his phone. He'd bought it 6 months earlier, mostly to video call his daughter who'd moved to Dar es Salaam for work. He started recording. Something told him this moment needed to be captured. He didn't know why yet, but he trusted his gut. And thank God he did, because that 30-second video would crack open a case so twisted, so methodically cruel, that it would shock not just Tanzania, but the entire international community. Let me paint you a picture of the Rufiji River Delta. It's this sprawling wetland ecosystem about 200 kilometers south of Dar es Salaam, where the river meets the Indian Ocean. Mangrove forests, mudflats, channels of water snaking through tall grass. It's remote, beautiful, and mostly untouched by modern development. The kind of place where nature still runs the show. The Mwanza Wildlife Research Institute had been operating a small field station near the delta since 2011. It wasn't anything fancy, just a handful of buildings where scientists could study the local ecosystem, monitor wildlife populations, that sort of thing. The director was a woman named Dr. Helena Bashiri, and by all accounts, she was brilliant. Cambridge educated, published in major scientific journals, respected throughout the African conservation community. Helena had dedicated her life to understanding animal behavior and cognition. She'd grown up in Arusha, fell in love with wildlife as a child, and made it her mission to prove that African animals possessed far more complex intelligence than most people gave them credit for. Noble work, right? The kind of career that should have been celebrated. But here's what made it even more horrific: the truth about what Helena was really doing in that isolated research station. After Moses recorded his video, he did what any concerned citizen would do. He showed it to his friend Daniel, who worked as a ranger for the Tanzania Wildlife Authority. Daniel took one look at that footage and felt his stomach drop. He recognized those protective suits. They weren't standard ranger uniforms. They looked more like something you'd wear when handling hazardous materials or conducting field autopsies. Daniel contacted his supervisor immediately. By the afternoon of June 14, 2019, a team of wildlife officers and local police were heading toward the coordinates Moses had provided. What they found when they arrived would haunt every single person involved in the investigation. The creature Moses had filmed was dead. That much was obvious. But the way it had died, that was the nightmare. The animal's jaws had been wired completely shut with industrial-grade cable ties, the thick kind used in construction, designed to hold hundreds of pounds of pressure. Its body showed signs of severe malnutrition and dehydration, and when the initial veterinary examination was conducted on site, they found something in its stomach that sent chills down everyone's spine: partially dissolved capsules of human medications, powerful sedatives, the kind that would slowly shut down an animal's system over weeks. This wasn't a natural death. This wasn't even a quick, merciful killing. This was prolonged, calculated torture. The responding officers immediately began looking for the two individuals Moses had filmed. It didn't take long to connect them to the Mwanza Wildlife Research Institute. One of the protective suits had been left behind in the rush to leave the scene, probably when they spotted Moses and realized they'd been seen. Inside the suit's pocket was an ID card belonging to Dr. Helena Bashiri herself. When officers arrived at the research station at 6:47 p.m. that evening, Helena was there, calmly organizing papers in her office. She seemed surprised to see them, but not panicked, not guilty. She invited them in with a smile, offered them tea, acted like she had absolutely nothing to hide. "I heard there was some concern about an animal death near the Delta," she said pleasantly. "We've been monitoring the wildlife populations in that area. Was it disease-related? I'd be happy to examine the carcass if it would help." The lead investigator, Inspector James Lwanga, wasn't buying it. He'd been doing this job for 19 years, and he knew when someone was performing. Helena's calm wasn't the calm of an innocent person. It was the calm of someone who'd been expecting this moment and had already prepared her story. "Dr. Bashiri," James said, placing a photograph of the cable-tied animal on her desk, "we'd like to ask you about this creature, and about why you were at the scene this morning. Here's the thing about people who commit methodical crimes. They often can't resist the urge to explain themselves. They want you to understand their logic, their reasoning, their brilliance, and Helena was no exception. She didn't deny being there. Instead, she leaned back in her chair and said something that would be quoted in every news report about the case. That animal taught me more about consciousness and pain tolerance than 15 years of conventional research ever could." The room went silent. Everyone present knew they'd just heard a confession, but the enormity of what it meant hadn't quite sunk in yet. Inspector Lwanga made the decision right then. "Dr. Helena Bashiri, you're under arrest on suspicion of animal cruelty and illegal research practices. You have the right to remain silent." Helena didn't resist. She stood up, extended her wrists for the handcuffs, and said calmly, "You'll want to search my office. The research is quite comprehensive. 7 subjects in total. You'll find all the documentation you need." 7 subjects. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. When the forensic team arrived at Helena's office at the research station the next morning, they found exactly what she'd promised: comprehensive documentation. But what they discovered was so disturbing that 3 members of the team had to take breaks during the initial review. Helena had kept meticulous journals. We're talking hundreds of pages of handwritten notes, detailed sketches, photographs, even video recordings. She documented everything, every experiment, every observation, every moment of suffering she'd inflicted, and she'd titled her work The Consciousness Through Adversity Project. The first subject, which she'd designated as Subject 1, had been a juvenile animal she'd captured in February 2015. According to her notes, she'd begun by simply observing its behavior in captivity, measuring its problem-solving abilities with various puzzles and challenges. Standard cognitive research stuff. Nothing illegal yet. But then the entries started to change. Helena began writing about her frustration with conventional limitations in animal research. She wrote about her belief that true consciousness could only be measured when an animal was forced to confront extreme adversity. Pain, she theorized, was the ultimate test of self-awareness. By April 2015, Subject 1's jaw had been partially wired, limiting its ability to eat. Helena documented the animal's attempts to remove the wires, describing its problem-solving strategies in clinical detail. She noted when it tried to use rocks to break the cables. She recorded how many days it took before the creature stopped trying and simply accepted its fate. She measured its weight loss daily. Subject 1 died on May 23, 2015, after 74 days of captivity. Cause of death: starvation and dehydration. Helena's final note about the subject was chilling in its detachment. Subject demonstrated advanced cognitive function until approximately day 60, after which survival instinct appeared to override conscious problem-solving. Conclusion: consciousness diminishes when physical resources become critically depleted. The investigators reading these journals couldn't believe what they were seeing. This wasn't research. This was torture dressed up in scientific language. And it didn't stop with Subject 1. Between 2015 and 2019, Helena had captured and tortured 6 more animals, each time refining her methods, each time pushing the boundaries of cruelty further. She experimented with different types of restraints, different medications, different levels of sensory deprivation. She documented everything with the cold precision of someone who genuinely believed she was making groundbreaking discoveries. Subject 7, the animal Moses had filmed, was her latest experiment. According to the journals, Helena had captured it in March 2019 and had been conducting her observations for 3 full months before its death. The creature had endured 91 days of systematic torture before finally succumbing. But here's what haunted everyone involved in the investigation. Helena had submitted grant proposals based on this work. She'd written academic papers, heavily sanitized, of course, that hinted at her findings without revealing her methods. She'd even presented at a conservation conference in Nairobi in 2017, discussing novel approaches to understanding animal cognition in stress scenarios. Nobody had questioned her. Why would they? She was Dr. Helena Bashiri, the respected conservationist with impeccable credentials. The forensic team also found something else in Helena's office: a video camera with dozens of recordings. These weren't just documentary footage, they were proof of her presence at each death scene. In several videos, you could hear Helena's voice narrating her observations as the animals died. She described their breathing patterns, their eye movements, their final moments, all with the detached tone of a nature documentarian describing a sunset. Inspector Lwanga spent hours watching those videos, forcing himself to sit through every disturbing second. Years later, in an interview with Tanzania's national newspaper, he said, "I've investigated murders, kidnappings, terrible crimes against humans, but there was something about the calculated nature of what Dr. Bashiri did that shook me to my core. She didn't hate these animals. She found them fascinating, and that made it somehow worse." The case was quickly escalating beyond local authorities. Tanzania's Ministry of Natural Resources got involved. International wildlife organizations were demanding information. Media outlets were picking up the story, and the public reaction was swift and furious. How had this been allowed to happen? How had Helena operated for 4 years without anyone noticing? Where was the oversight? The Mwanza Wildlife Research Institute immediately launched an internal investigation. What they discovered was a perfect storm of negligence and misplaced trust. Helena had been given significant autonomy because of her reputation and track record. She'd always submitted required reports, always maintained the appearance of legitimate research. She'd worked alone most of the time, claiming that her behavioral studies required minimal human presence to avoid corrupting the data. Everyone had trusted her, and she'd used that trust to hide atrocities in plain sight. Helena's trial began on September 3, 2019, in the regional court in Lindi. The prosecution was led by Chief State Attorney Margaret Ndunguru, a formidable lawyer known for her meticulous preparation and passionate arguments. The courtroom was packed every single day. Local residents, journalists from around the world, wildlife advocates, students, curious onlookers, everyone wanted to see the woman who'd committed these acts, to try to understand how someone could do such things. Helena sat calmly at the defense table throughout the proceedings. She'd hired a prominent defense attorney from Dar es Salaam, Michael Tembo, who attempted to argue that his client's actions, while ethically questionable, were protected under academic research freedoms, and that the charges of animal cruelty were too harsh given her scientific intentions. The prosecution wasn't having any of it. Margaret Ndunguru systematically dismantled every defense argument, using Helena's own journals as evidence of premeditated cruelty. "This was not research," Margaret stated during her opening arguments. "Research has protocols. Research has ethical oversight. Research has limits. What Dr. Bashiri conducted was torture, pure and simple. She found loopholes in our wildlife protection laws and exploited them to satisfy her own twisted curiosity." The trial lasted 6 weeks, and the evidence presented was overwhelming. Veterinary experts testified about the suffering the animals had endured. Forensic psychologists analyzed Helena's journals and concluded she showed signs of severe empathy deficiency and obsessive behavior. Conservation officials detailed how she'd manipulated permits and misrepresented her work, but the most powerful moment in the trial came when that video, the one Moses Kimathi had captured on his phone, was played in court. The courtroom went silent as the footage appeared on screens throughout the room. There was Helena, crouched beside Subject 7's body, calmly taking photographs and measurements. You could see the cable ties around the animal's mouth. You could see the creature's emaciated body, and you could see Helena's complete lack of distress or remorse. Moses himself testified, describing what he'd witnessed that morning. "I thought they were trying to help," he said quietly. "I thought I was filming a rescue. I never imagined I was documenting a crime scene." His testimony was devastating in its simplicity. Here was an ordinary man who'd done the right thing, who'd trusted his instincts, who'd ultimately saved who knows how many future animals from suffering the same fate. The video footage became crucial to the prosecution's case, just as Inspector Lwanga had predicted. It provided irrefutable proof that Helena had been at the scene, that she'd been in close contact with Subject 7, that her earlier claims about just observing natural deaths were complete fabrications. The metadata on Moses's phone confirmed the date and time, matching perfectly with the estimated time of death determined by veterinary pathologists. As the trial progressed, more disturbing details emerged. Investigators had traced Helena's veterinary medication purchases and found she'd been ordering controlled sedatives for years, always in small quantities that wouldn't raise red flags, always with plausible explanations about treating sick wildlife. She'd been planning this systematically, setting up her torture operation piece by piece, year by year. The defense tried to argue that Helena was suffering from mental illness, that she needed psychiatric treatment rather than imprisonment. They brought in their own expert witnesses who diagnosed her with various personality disorders and suggested she couldn't be held fully responsible for her actions. But Margaret Ndunguru countered with Helena's own words from her journals. Clear, coherent, methodical planning that demonstrated she knew exactly what she was doing and understood that it was wrong. In one particularly damning journal entry from 2016, Helena had written, "I understand this work cannot be published in current academic climate. Too many emotional barriers, but the knowledge gained justifies the methods." She knew it was wrong. She did it anyway. That was the prosecution's entire argument in a nutshell. The defense also tried to argue that Helena had made valuable scientific contributions that should be considered during sentencing. They pointed to her earlier legitimate research, her publications, her standing in the conservation community. Margaret Ndunguru's response was withering. Would we weigh a murderer's community service against their crimes? Would we offer leniency to a kidnapper because they once volunteered at a school? Dr. Bashiri's previous good work does not erase the systematic torture she inflicted on 7 innocent creatures over 4 years. On October 18, 2019, after just 4 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. Guilty on all 7 counts of aggravated animal cruelty, guilty on 3 counts of illegal possession of controlled substances, guilty on 4 counts of falsifying research documents, and guilty on 1 count of operating an unregistered experimental facility. Helena showed no emotion as the verdict was read. She simply nodded slightly as if confirming something she'd already known would happen. The sentencing hearing took place 1 week later. The prosecution requested the maximum penalty under Tanzania's Wildlife Conservation Act. They argued that Helena's crimes represented not just individual acts of cruelty, but a betrayal of the scientific community and the conservation movement as a whole. Before the judge delivered her sentence, she asked Helena if she had anything to say. Helena stood, looked directly at the judge, and spoke for the first time since the trial began. "I regret that my work will never be understood," she said. "I discovered profound truths about consciousness, about the nature of suffering and awareness. But I understand that society isn't ready for such knowledge. I accept the consequences of pursuing truth in a world that prefers comfortable ignorance." Even in that moment facing prison, Helena couldn't acknowledge what she'd actually done. She still saw herself as a misunderstood scientist rather than a torturer. The judge's response was sharp and unforgiving. "Dr. Bashiri, you discovered nothing except the depths of your own cruelty. The only truth revealed by your actions is that intelligence without empathy is not brilliance, it's monstrosity." The judge sentenced Helena Bashiri to 14 years in prison, 2 years for each of the 7 animals she'd tortured and killed. She would be eligible for parole after serving at least 10 years, though the judge noted that any parole decision would require Helena to demonstrate genuine remorse and understanding of her crimes. Helena is currently serving her sentence at the Lindy Women's Correctional Facility. According to prison officials, she spends most of her time in the facility's library, reading scientific journals and writing what she claims is a memoir. She has never expressed remorse for her actions. The Mwanza Wildlife Research Institute was shut down permanently in November 2019. The Tanzanian government conducted a comprehensive review of all wildlife research facilities in the country, implementing new oversight protocols and mandatory ethical review boards. Helena's case became a catalyst for reform across East Africa, with Kenya, Uganda, and Rwanda all updating their wildlife research regulations in response. Moses Kimathi became something of a local hero. He was honored by the Tanzania Wildlife Authority and received a National Citizen Award for his role in exposing Helena's crimes. He used some of the reward money to buy a better boat for his fishing business and saved the rest for his grandchildren's education. But he says the recognition isn't what matters most to him. "I just did what anyone should do," he told reporters. "I saw something wrong and I spoke up." The marsh area where Subject 7 died has been transformed into a protected memorial site, with a small monument erected to honor all 7 animals who suffered and died at Helena's hands. Local school groups often visit the site, and teachers use the case as an example of why ethical guidelines exist, why oversight matters, why good intentions alone are never enough to justify causing harm. The case raised difficult questions about the intersection of science, ethics, and law. Where is the line between legitimate research and torture? How do we balance scientific freedom with animal welfare? How do we prevent abuse while still allowing important research to proceed? These questions don't have easy answers, but Helena's case demonstrated why they must be continually asked. Dr. Helena Bashiri was convicted of 7 counts of aggravated animal cruelty, 3 counts of illegal possession of controlled substances, 4 counts of falsifying research documents, and 1 count of operating an unregistered experimental facility. She received a total sentence of 14 years imprisonment with eligibility for parole after 10 years, pending demonstrated rehabilitation and remorse. The 7 animals Helena called her subjects never had names. They were never given the dignity of individual identity in her eyes, just numbers in an experiment. But they weren't subjects, they were victims, and their suffering, documented so meticulously by the woman who caused it, stands as a permanent reminder that the pursuit of knowledge must always be tempered by compassion, that scientific curiosity without ethical boundaries is not enlightenment but darkness, and that we judge the morality of our society not by how we treat those who can advocate for themselves, but by how we protect those who cannot. May the 7 rest in peace, and may their tragedy serve as an eternal warning against the dangers of curiosity untethered from conscience.